Hello, Garland Nixon here with the good Dr. Nicolai Petro. He's the author of The Tragedy of Ukraine. He's a professor at the University of Rhode Island who specializes in Ukraine. And oh, sorry about that. He
Ukraine.
specializes in Ukraine and Russia and Eastern Europe. And we got a lot to talk about. Let's talk. Hello, Garland Nixon here, back with Professor Nicolai Petro, a person who I have worked with now for the last couple of years on and off on the issue of the potential for peace in the Ukraine conflict and throughout Eastern Europe, etc. And I really appreciate the work that he's done. I've seen him at many places online and read a lot of his work, his book, The Tragedy of Ukraine. I would recommend that you find that on Amazon or wherever you can find it online. Dr. Petro, welcome back and thank you for your hard work.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Garland, and kudos to you too for the same.
A couple of things. Let me ask you this. Did you get a chance to watch the interview I did with Ambassador Dmitry Polyansky a week or so ago?
I did not,
but
okay. I think I know his views, and I'm happy to comment on anything you might have said.
Oh, great. Well, let me say this. First of all, my experience with him is he's a brilliant man, a brilliant diplomat. And, he's a person who I think is in line for big things in the future in Russia and in world affairs. Let's go here. This is what I want to ask you about. This is really the issue, because we're looking at, kind of, I'm not going to say realignments, but some acceptance of the shift in world power, of multipolarity. We're hearing things out of the Trump administration I thought I'd never hear. But poor old Europe. Europe's being left behind. And I say poor old Europe for the people in Europe. We have leaders in Europe that seem to be unrealistic, that the truth of the matter is, the fact is, the US and Russia are the superpowers that actually clashed in Ukraine. And now both of them are talking about very, very good things, I might say, whether it happens or not, whatever. But there's really positive discussions going on. Europe seems to have some internal conflicts, particularly the leadership in Europe. Your thoughts?
Right. I mean, the dam holding up peace efforts, or not even to go that far, the dam preventing a ceasefire, the end of the fighting and the end of the killing, was the unwillingness of Ukraine, supported by Europe, not to have any dialogue with Russia. That was the sum total of Europe's foreign policy. Do not have dialogue with Russia. In which case, it's impossible to end the war. Even if there were a negotiated settlement between Ukraine and Russia, it seems to me that based on the rhetoric of NATO leaders, Europe would have kept fighting on behalf of a Ukraine that had already reached an accord. It's a very strange situation that they were fighting for a country that is not part of NATO, is tangentially part of Europe, or no more so than Russia as a whole. But there seems to have been some sort of particular attempt by the current European leadership to ostracize Russia. And this was accompanied not just in political terms, sort of diplomatically, but it was accompanied by cultural exclusion, by an attempt to silence all Russian media outlets, any Russian voices, any public manifestations in support of dialogue with the other side. And this has, I think, truly damaged the image of Europe as a peace project after World War II. That's how it was sold, the EU, and ultimately NATO as well, as a peace project in the eyes of many Europeans, which is why we are likely to see a significant political shift in key Western and Eastern European countries. The top two that come to mind, because they have elections imminently, are Germany and Romania. There again, let's say the side which is willing to talk to Russia and willing to engage and reintegrate Russia into Europe is likely to win substantial approval. And that will shift the political discourse. And I suspect there will be something similar in many other European countries over the next year. There will be similar political crises that will lead to early elections in a number of different countries. And if this happens in parallel and alongside with some sort of successful negotiations between the only people who are engaged right now are the Trump administration and Russia, that will change the dynamic. It will give a strong impetus for peace and support for these, some call them right wing, but they're also on the left wing in Europe. And some call them pro-Russians. They're not really pro-Russian, they're pro-peace, but they're willing to talk to Russia. So the terminology needs to be broadened. And the Trump administration is providing cover, I would say, for these pro-peace groups in Europe.
One of the things that I think is interesting is I'm reading now that the Saudis are going to be mediators. I read about a discussion, a long discussion that was had, the two long discussions, one with Trump and Putin, one with Rubio and Lavrov, right? But what I found interesting was the discussions were much more robust than simply, let's talk about Ukraine. They were discussions. We can talk about a lot of other things. It seems to me that the people who have come to power in the US now see Russia for the world power that it is, see Russia as a potential economic outlaw, economic, I'm not going to use the word ally, economic partner from a realistic, here's a powerful country with a great history. We have to, A, respect them. Great. B, we have to say they've got a lot, they're a powerful player on the economic and military world stage. And how can we work that to our economic advantage and maybe do, you know what I mean? It seems to real politics. And Europe is stuck in, ooh, the Russians are bad, in this very almost juvenile, simplistic paradigm. The Russians are the baddies and we're the goodies. And the Americans are talking to the Russians, you got things that we need. We got things that you need. Anyway, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think the watchword for the Trump administration, it's been used a number of times in the speeches over the last few weeks, is realism. In other words, Russia under the Biden administration was always losing. Every month it was losing, but that clearly didn't correspond to the reality. But there was no way for the people in the Biden administration to backtrack on their own ideological commitments. They weren't able to do that for some reason. As a result, the discrepancy between the situation on the ground and Russia's real economy versus the caricature of it that was painted by the administration became greater and greater and greater. What happened in Europe, I think, was that the leading partners of the United States in NATO simply followed the lead of the United States and were willing to do so based on two promises made by Biden. One was, we'll pay for it, we'll take the lead, we will not allow for this conflict to expand. We don't want that, but we want it to simmer for a while because Russia will suffer as a result. It'll be cut down to size. That'll be to the advantage of you Europeans, and you won't really suffer that much because we have your back on the expenses, and we will provide comparables for Russian gas. Now, what they didn't tell the Europeans was that they would be paying more for those resources. They would secondarily become more dependent on the US as a result of this, both economically, politically, and militarily. And the Europeans basically swallowed the American lead hook, line, and sinker. So when Putin said, he's not worried about the Europeans, he said recently, because they will come to heel at the master's call. He's not, unfortunately, and I say this as a person who is himself a political realist and would like to see Europe play a more independent and autonomous role. I mean, it has a lot to contribute to world affairs. And it's sad to see not Europeans, but the current generation of political leaders in key Western countries abandon their responsibilities to the well-being of Europeans themselves, of their own population. And I'm far from the first person to say this. My friend and colleague in Germany, who's been ostracized for this, Alexander Rahr, has said this, been saying this for a number of years. A lot of Russian analysts were looking at this picture and saying, why is Europe actively, the current European leadership, actively committing political suicide? And we are seeing this political suicide come to fruition right now. I mean, I don't care who cares what Scholz says, what the Chancellor of Germany says. He's not going to be in office. Well, he might lead a caretaker government because it will be difficult to arrange for a substitution once his party falls from first place to third, if it's lucky. It could even be fourth place, which I think is the worst position the SPD has ever had since in elections since World War II. And we see as a direct consequence of this, there's no one to blame but the SPD, the Social Democrats, the Liberals, and the Greens especially, for the rise of the Alternative for Germany, which the Western media calls a right-wing party, and but they disavow that term and call themselves simply a popular party of the center-right.
Let me ask you this, Keir Starmer. It's like, to me, it's like they are wedded to a narrative, right? The narrative that the Biden administration have, and it's as you spoke earlier. Oh, the Russians are always losing, no matter what. The narrative does not need to be relative to what's happening in the universe upon which the plane upon which we reside, right? Here's the narrative: the Russians are losing, they're bad, blah, blah. Okay, and here we have Keir Starmer saying, I'm ready to commit troops to Ukraine, which in itself, the people are kind of sounding threatening, but I'm like, yeah, they don't even, he had a 99 or 100-year deal that they signed for the protection of Ukraine. They have nothing. It's like,
it's a fantasy.
Exactly. Okay. Exactly as you said, as the UK is in economic, an economic spiral downward. It's as George Carlin would say, circling the drain. Your thoughts on the UK, Keir Starmer, et cetera?
Yeah, I've followed British politics from a distance, and it's again one of those countries like Germany, like France, to a lesser extent Italy, because there are moral alternative political voices willing to engage with Russia in Italy than there are in France, Germany, and the UK. But in the UK, what I read in the British press points out that the British do not have the financial resources. They do not have the military resources today to send any meaningful troop support. In other words, they would have to be, there are different kinds of peacekeeping forces. And in almost every instance that I can think of, peacekeeping forces are not there to keep the peace. They are there to be a tripwire and die, if necessary, justifying thereafter a stronger military intervention, which the United Kingdom cannot afford. So the United Kingdom, it simply has no relevant military capability that could be brought to the field of battle in this case. So I did want to say, you reminded me of what I didn't answer about the U.S. position. Your last question. One was the increasing emphasis on realism and a realistic assessment of the situation on the ground, which means, one, that Russia is beating the Ukrainian military decisively in its encounters on the battlefield in Ukraine. And secondly, there is no future prospect for an improvement in Ukrainian, the balance of power in favor of Ukraine. It has lost the manpower resources. It has nothing to contribute that would change the balance, the military balance there in terms of its technology that could bring to the fore. Everything would have to be imported, and everything would have to be paid for by someone else. And in exchange, well, they're now being presented the bill. Both, I mean, we have two types of bills for that Ukraine has to face. One is the billions in repayments of the money that has not been given to Ukraine but loaned to Ukraine, which will be a burden on the Ukrainian economy for the next 3 to 4 decades, lowering its economic growth. And the second is the bill for, well, essentially what the Trump administration wants is collateral. It's collateral saying, okay, we'll give you equipment, but you have to sign over to us the deeds to the keys to the store.
Right.
Everything that you could possibly make money on, we want to make money on first, and then leave the crumbs for you afterwards. And that is a typical colonial perspective. I mean, it's so obvious. It doesn't even bear, I mean, I would say that Zelensky had to reject this offer because he would have, it would be such a betrayal, such an obvious betrayal of the future of Ukraine after whatever settlement is achieved, that he would have to flee the country. I mean, he would be decried as someone who, once this is all revealed, would be seen as one of the chief architects of Ukraine's demise as a country over the next decade or several decades. But the second aspect of this realism is, so you said, is recognize Russia as a global power. I'm not so sure. That is actually the stance of the Trump administration. I think if it is, it's of a minority of people in the Trump administration. I
Yes.
think the main actors in the Trump administration are looking for some way to to forge alliances in the world that could be used to counter China. That would they're focused not on Russia and what it can do for the United States, but they're focused on diminishing China's role in world affairs. And they are, as realists, extremely worried, and rightly so, I think, by the alliance that has been forged between Russia and China. They see that if that alliance continues apace and even expands, then that combination spells the doom of United States, America's hegemony in the world, and the end of any prospects for prosperity and security for Europe as a whole. But so the objective here is to wean Russia away from China by suggesting to Russia that the United States can be a partner, can be a reliable partner on the world stage, that it can influence the Europeans to engage with Russia, and that this will be a win-win situation for Russia as well, they will argue, because this is a staple in Washington thinking that Russia doesn't, the leaders of Russia today don't realize how dangerous it is for them to be subordinate and dependent on China. The rhetoric coming out of Washington is that it's time for Russia to realize, and we can explain to them, that they are nothing but a junior partner to China. And now that we are shifting our focus to China, we're willing, as it might be, we're willing to allow Russia to back into our coalition, which will be the winning coalition against China. But I'll just summarize my perspective on this by saying it ain't going to happen.
Yeah.
There is no way that the United States today, with all of the permutations that have happened flipping back and forth over the last 20, 30 years, can be seen as a reliable partner. What's to prevent the next democratic liberal expansionist from coming to power 4 years from now or 8 years from now? You cannot conduct a serious foreign policy through the whims of an individual. This is not the 18th century. This is not even the early 19th century. We're talking about stable institutions, integrated economies, artificial intelligence that spans continents, and the role of the individual in this, and the attempts of the United States to isolate itself from world events and to subordinate those world events to itself, just doesn't have any future, it seems to me.
I'm with you. I often, I'll talk when I'm discussing these things. One of the things I like to do is refer to my father, who was, as I've often said, longshoreman, old school guy, the story, third grade education guy, hard working, hard hat kind of guy. But they were those kind of people, grew up with nothing, were very realistic about life. You know what I mean? They saw life very, very clearly as it was. There was no narratives for people like that.
It was a time when not everybody lived in debt. And you needed to pay cash on the barrel. Yep. And you could make a deal on a handshake because people were trustworthy.
Yeah, exactly. And there was a term that he had about deals. You make a deal with someone, he was a longshoreman. He did mechanic work on the side. Some guy, I'd like you to fix my car. And this is what he'd say. Looks like I'm going to need the money up front. Yeah. That's the kind of deals that the Russians are going to have to make with the U.S. None of this, blah, blah, blah. It's going to be after the kind of deal that my dad would make. Looks like I'm going to need the money up front. We're going to do this. Looks like I'm going to need. Go ahead.
Do you remember when the SWIFT when the international banking exchange system called SWIFT cut out Russia, which
Yep.
was an early a founding member of it, of the SWIFT consortium. And as a result, what happened was that Russia said, okay, well, we are now going to go to payment upfront and payment in national currencies. And all of our, not all, but a lot of our economic pundits says, oh, that'll never work, et cetera. And then it worked. And then that's exactly what people who needed that energy were willing to do. And so Russia understands the principles of the international economic system better than our Wall Street whiz kids. I'm sorry to have to tell people this, but it's true. Look at the past 3 years of our attempts to crush the Russian economy and how they have not only failed, they have backfired. They have backfired. I have a list of more than 50 articles of over the last 3 years indicating how Russia has overcome this problem, how Russia has overcome that problem, how for the last 2 years has been growing at a rate nearly double that of Europe's economies, and has overtaken both Britain and Germany in purchasing power parity in terms of gross domestic product. So we are clearly not understanding the functioning of the Russian economy and how well integrated it still is in the global economy. And I don't see any way to replace that. And what makes it even more likely to succeed is this pairing with China. Everything that Russia needs technologically and in terms of investment, China has. Everything that China needs in terms of raw materials and skilled, highly technological labor force, Russia has. So it's a marriage, it's a match made in heaven.
Well, and I have to add this, and Russia's historical, diplomatic, and cultural ties to Africa, to the Middle East, you know what I mean? Which China is growing, but China was more very, very regional in Asia, right? And it wasn't necessarily even a regional economic power, but it was a regional cultural power, powerful culture, historical long. But Russia helped, the Soviet Union in Africa. You see people in Africa and they're protesting against U.S. imperialism, whatever. They're holding Russian flags. A friend of mine said he was in the Middle East and there was a big sign with President Putin and it said protector of the Quran because he had signed some law that you couldn't burn the Quran. You know what I mean? Which I might add this, not just the fact that in the real world, Russia and China has one of the longest borders on earth, which is critical. Yeah. You got neighborhood, you have geography there, which can't be separated. But China has the money, Russia has the natural resources, and Russia has the ties in Africa and all of these places that is of great benefit to China. Your thoughts?
I don't think that Russia's interest in Africa is that serious a factor in the minds of the African elite. I think they're very pragmatic about this relationship. There is one thing, though, that Russia has done, which the West has been incapable of doing. The West generally, and even the United States, which is a little bit odd given our African American population. But it's never been able to successfully argue that it is past its colonial heritage, that it's past its history, and it is willing to look at Africa as a serious actor on the world stage. And whether you believe it or not, Putin has been making this argument for the last 10 or 15 years. And granted, it was when he was shut out from Europe and other areas, he didn't ignore Africa, which is the tendency among all Western analysts, generally speaking, but he actually invited he hosted a meeting of African leaders in the Kremlin. I mean, he went out of his way to build those relationships. And he's been doing so for the past decade. By the way, we shouldn't overlook Latin America as well.
Yes, yes, yes.
But the thing about Africa that I was always struck by is, and the American attitude, American elite, foreign policy elite's attitude toward Africa, is I remember seeing a survey that was done in Foreign Policy magazine, must have been more than 20 years ago, saying, well, which regions of the world are going to be important over the next, are important now? And it's, Africa was down at the bottom. And which are going to be important 20 years from now? Africa's still at the bottom. In other words, there's a mindset there that isn't changing, and there's no prospect for changing because, oddly enough, there's no constituency here that says, hey, let's reach out to Africa, let's build there, let's build these connections and things like that. So for whatever reason, and some of them are purely selfish, no doubt, Russia doesn't have to fight this legacy of European colonialism, and it is therefore seen as a plausible alternative and has in fact reached out and made those connections and offers to African leaders. And it may not pay off in the short term, but I'm sure it'll pay off in the long term.
Two things I'd like to hit on. Let me start. This is a very important one. Well, I'll just make this statement. It is my belief, and get this from you, but this is going to be critical to discuss. And I don't know the answer for this, but let's start here. At some point, and this is regarding President Putin's statement that the vassals will be brought to heel, to paraphrase it. At some point, let's just say for the sake of argument, the Russians and the Trump people sit down and they hack out a deal. They hack out something that, the Russians say, I think we can do something with this. So they sit down and it looks like we're really getting somewhere, and they shake hands and
it's likely they'll achieve a ceasefire, but not necessarily a peace.
Right. But they get something.
Yeah.
It is my feeling that they get something concrete. They get something that the world looks at and says, you did something right there. You got something. We're moving in the right direction. Bombs aren't exploding. Okay. It is my thought that if the Europeans go bananas, everybody talked about what leverage do we have on Russia? Knowing Trump and his inclinations, it seems to me that he'll say, look, Europe, you will do this, or he has tremendous leverage. The fact that the Europeans have disconnected when it comes to gas and LNG, and now they're getting all of that stuff from the US. They have handed the Trump administration much more leverage over Europe than he would have had, say, before this event started. And it is my belief, knowing the inclinations of Trump, that he will use all of that leverage and ultimately say to the Europeans, either you go along with this deal and sign off on it and shut up and accept it and support it, or be crushed, which he will have the ability to snatch the economic rug. And they gave him that ability.
Yes.
Your thoughts?
Yeah. So I think you're right. Europe, the current political leadership of Europe is more dependent on the United States and America's goodwill than before. It makes but it isolates them with this political elite in Europe, which is already increasingly isolated from its own population. Again, I think the current political elite in Europe is on the way out, and maybe for a long time. It's hard to see what arguments they could bring to bear to restore trust in themselves. The alternative to the liberal elite, whatever you call it, on the center right, in each country, in every country in Europe, including Eastern Europe now, has a party that, for want of a better term, is pro-Russian, or at least is willing to talk to Russia. The Trump administration, if I'm right about the Trump administration's strategy, which is to bring Russia in, reconnect the ties to Europe, not necessarily with the United States. We don't want to give Russia that leverage over the United States. What America wants to do is to give Europe leverage over Russia, Europe being our dependent and therefore our surrogate in relations with Europe. But, Russians have a fondness for Europe. I mean, they think of themselves as Europeans. That probably hasn't gone away despite all of the, entirely gone away, despite all of the rhetoric. It's very difficult for Russians, 70% of whom live in European Russia, so west of the Ural Mountains, to look at China as anything but a distant culture. They don't have that cultural connection that they obviously have with Europeans. So I think that's the direction that it's going to go. But at the same time, if we do have an alternative, a change in government in many European countries, it offers the possibility of a more independent Europe. Certainly, the current Europe, the current people who are upset in Europe with Vance and say we need an independent foreign policy, they are completely not credible in that. I mean, they have always willingly subordinated the interests of their country to the United States, and now they don't like the result. That just proves they're either lying or they're idiots. They couldn't see that. They couldn't see this coming. Yeah. So as a result, it'll offer an alternative. But this too may be something that the Trump administration would not necessarily object to. I mean, if their vision of multipolarity, a word that Secretary of State Rubio has used in a positive context, includes a culturally aligned and philosophically aligned Europe that nevertheless is predictable because it will defend its own interests, just as we defend our interests. So we're defending our interests, the interests of North America. Europe will defend its interests. Russia will defend its interests. China will defend its interests. The Middle Eastern countries, Iran, etc., will each defend their own interests. And that makes, in the Trump administration's understanding, that makes for a more predictable type of multipolarity without coalitions ganging up on each other and allowing for independent, prosperous cooperation based on the national interest, properly understood. Then that too is okay. That too is a positive outcome. It doesn't necessarily weaken the security guarantee of NATO. This is a debatable point, but there is an argument to be made that NATO's exaggerated claims to offer, this is the way it's interpreted, it's not the Article 5 protection doesn't actually work this way. It's not an automatic defense of whatever territory is seized. It actually would have to go through all sorts of debates and committees, et cetera, to see what the NATO response would be. But right now, we have clearly a divided NATO with members who are not willing to support it and could, if they were convinced that it would lead to the destruction of their own countries and the invasion of their own countries from, their countries becoming a battlefield between East and West, like Slovakia and Hungary, then they would probably say NATO, they would veto NATO action, say, NATO, stand down. You're not allowed to retaliate. And that throws the entire context of NATO's reliability into question. That's the way it is right now. I would argue that we need an alternative to that is a better and more plausible security guarantee. One of the reasons that the United States ultimately abandoned the nuclear strategy of mutual assured destruction is that by the end of the 1960s, nobody believed that the president would push the button in response. They said, well, so they invade some territory and we're going to nuke the world in response. We're all going to commit suicide. That's implausible. So it became an argument for saying, well, let's reach agreements that could be measured and that there is a clearer sense of what we will defend and how we will defend it against invasion, rather than the sky's the limit. And if you take 1 inch of our territory, we'll blow the world to kingdom come, because that's not a credible deterrent.
Let me ask you this. EU, NATO, the issue I think now, particularly with rising political powers, entities, parties, however you want to frame it, in the European bloc, the new people that are coming to power seem to really be in opposition to European Union. They see it as a supranational, which it really is, and they call it it's unelected, et cetera. And it hasn't worked out. Let's be to be practical, hasn't worked out in their best interest, right? Hasn't worked out for more democracy. It's given them less democracy. We have so many parties saying, NATO is not working for us. We want more independence and sovereignty. And I've made this statement. It seems to me that one of the things that a lot of people in Europe learned was that they didn't have the independence and sovereignty that they thought they had, that their ruling elites simply worked for the people in Foggy Bottom rather than the people of the outskirts of Paris. Right. Okay. The future of NATO, EU, these bloc organizations in Europe that I think there's going to be a major pushback against. Your thoughts on that?
Yes, but I don't expect radical changes anytime soon, because, well, I mean, you could say, well, what about what's happening in the United States? It's more difficult to do something like that in Europe, because we are talking about 27 governments involved. Some will go this way, some will go that way. They'll make different proposals. Everything gets negotiated. That means it is both ineffective in doing anything dramatic and ineffective even in agreeing on a single course of action, which is why all these the latest calls for a European-wide army are destined to follow the footsteps of the 100 other calls for a European-wide army that have been made over the last 30 years. And not because people can't see Russia as a threat. The problem is they can't act together. Henry Kissinger, when he was Secretary of State, so we're talking about the 1970s, said when talking about the foreign policy of Europe, says, "Who do I call? Who do I call to figure out, and negotiate with Europe?" There's no one person. There is one person now, but that person is having a difficult time, let's put it this way, grasping the complexity and the reality of the configurations in Europe, because I'm talking about Ms. Kallas, the Estonian from Estonia, who is now the European foreign minister. Her ideology prevents her from accurately and faithfully, I think, representing the complexity of Europe's decision-making. She wants it to be one way, and there are very strong forces that she cannot control and that limit her ability to pull the rest of Europe in the direction that she would like it to be. So all of this leads to stymieing and a dead end in terms of foreign policy initiatives. So, having said that, what does the future hold? I think part of the realism that the United States is forcing upon Europe now is the realization that the United States does not want to have an open-ended commitment to European security and to the financial support of Europe. It can't afford either. It doesn't want that. And that Europe will have to step up to the plate and take more of this responsibility for itself. When it does that, there is no getting around the fact that it will also become thereby an independent actor, or a more independent actor. It will still, of course, be dependent on the United States as the senior partner, as the older brother, but it won't have to do as much. Do what is it won't always be at the United States' beck and call, which reminds Europeans of the situation that they were in with the United States in the early 1960s and through maybe the 1980s, the early 1980s, when you had independent for political leaders, people like Helmut Schmidt and Gerhard Schröder in Germany, and François Mitterrand, the president of France, who were willing to oppose, for example, the U.S. intervention in Iraq, and to say, this is clearly wrong. They could only go so far because they weren't willing to endanger the entire relationship. But if the relationship changes from one of utter dependence to having more ability to express and to defend themselves, at least, against any threat, be it a threat from migrants to the south or east, or a military threat from Russia, then, that also offers them a greater ability to determine their own voice in the future. So this will be a good thing overall, but it'll have to be implemented by the next generation of politicians, because the current generation of politicians who created this utter dependence on the United States are simply discredited.
Yeah,
and that's Europe-wide.
Yeah, I think they saw that dependence on the United States as their power base coming from the United States. So their dependence. So Sergei Lavrov has been talking. I'm going to throw a couple of things that he's been saying at you and just get your comments. West role in the conflict. If European countries attempt to bargain for a ceasefire in order to rearm Ukraine, there's no sense in allowing them to participate in negotiations. The West will not be able to sit and wait under the nuclear umbrella and will have to answer for its unlawful actions and support for the Nazi regime in Ukraine. One must take responsibility for one's actions, as the Bible says. The U.S. has been playing a leading role in the Ukrainian crisis since its very start, and now may contribute to the settlement. Sergei Lavrov, your thoughts?
He sounds exactly like Alice Weidel, the head of the Alternative for Germany. He sounds like Matteo Salvini, former vice chairman of the Council of Ministers of the Italian government, who is now in opposition to the Italian regime. He sounds like Georges, I think, Mélenchon, who is one of the leaders of the French opposition. I know what Lavrov has been saying all along has been, over the last year or two, increasingly picked up by the alternative political forces in Europe. One of the things that the Russian government has said very clearly with respect to Ukraine is that Ukraine, it's no sense in negotiating with Zelensky because Zelensky is illegitimate, having extended his mandate arbitrarily and not in conformity with the current Ukrainian constitution, or in violation of the current Ukrainian constitution. So we are looking for an agreement with a legitimate leader. The same, I think, is the position of the Russian government with respect to Europe as well. We cannot really negotiate with people who never wanted to negotiate with us to begin with, but they will soon be gone, and then we will be able to negotiate. The Trump administration's role in all this is to be, as Lenin put it, a midwife to history.
Interesting. Another, and this is the one I was going to hit on, and this is the big one. I don't know how you clean this up, but I was going to mention the the Banderite ideology that Russia feels has to be addressed, and based on their history, so certainly they would, right? This is from again from Lavrov's latest discussion. The Ukrainian army acts even worse than Hitler's murderers. The world should look at the atrocities they commit on the territories. Your thoughts on that particular issue? Now, one of the things that I've heard some very powerful people in Russia said, some voices of note say, look, if you're in Syria or Iraq or something like that, and atrocities are committed, you just can walk away from that, pretend like it didn't happen. This is a world superpower. When atrocities are committed at the end of this conflict, there's going to have to be some trials. There's going to have to be legitimate investigations into our claims of atrocity. You know what I mean? And so here's what I hear. The world should look at the atrocities they commit on territories, which sounds like an opening for maybe either UN or international bodies to come in and do it, to say, look, we are open. This is what I hear, for some international bodies or something to look into our claims of atrocities, that they have to be remedied, they have to be exposed. Anyway, your thoughts on that?
There's nothing preventing international bodies currently, and Russia has a full voice as a member of the Security Council in the United Nations from pursuing these investigations. One of the reasons they are known about is that Russia files these reports with the appropriate United Nations Commission for subsequent deliberation. So the problem is one of long historical standing, and is guided by the immoral principle that the victors write the histories.
Right.
As a result, the full history of the history of the dead, the history of the oppressed, the history of those who have been unjustly persecuted and tortured is never presented in the same intensity and on the same scale as the history of the victors and their good cause. Having said that, the simple fact that Russia will continue to bring these issues to the fore is very important to clarifying and completing the historical record. But there's another instrument that is better than an international tribunal. It's better than an international tribunal. And it's one I talk about in my book, and I keep coming back to it. And the Pope keeps coming back to it as well. He's completely correct in what he talks about when he says people involved in conflicts must learn to forgive and to forget. True, that's the only way in which we put our anger and our desire for vengeance behind us and do not give it as a gift to our children, saying, I did my share of the killing, now you go out and do yours, which is a horrible prospect. But the only way to get beyond that is to engage as much of the population as wants to be engaged, and hopefully a large number over time, in this mechanism that I talk about in the last chapter of my book, Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, I like to point out, have existed for over 50 years and have been active in 46 countries, more than 46 countries around the world. There's a vast experience. and different ways and different mechanisms. The key factors, however, to allowing the population to move beyond hate and rebuild itself, to heal itself, and to rebuild its relations with other countries is A, getting all the sides involved. Secondly, state sponsorship, or at least state acquiescence, even if there is sponsorship by a variety of other organizations, international. However, the state has to be supportive and willing to offer at least security for all the people who yesterday were labeled traitors, and today we find them in our midst and find that we have to live with them and their children in the future. And how is this all done? By giving everyone a voice at the table and making a public record of it. That's the essential component of truth and reconciliation, is bringing everyone to the table, listening to their voices. The simple fact of hearing what other people suffered, that you thought you were the only one suffering, and now you understand that there was suffering among your enemies as well. And you begin to start to ask yourself, A, how justified was I in inflicting this suffering? Was my cause in inflicting this suffering? And secondarily, how much do I want to continue this suffering and share it, foist it really upon my children and their children? Or is it time to end this mutual recrimination? And all of that has been done more or less successfully. I'm not going to say it's a cure-all, just like confession. Confession at communion is not a cure-all. I know for myself, I keep sinning, and often the same problem comes back and back. But nevertheless, we understand what leads to healing, and keeping our eye on that prize, knowing how it is the mechanisms that we've had since ancient Greek times for 2,500 years that have been reinvigorated in all the civil wars that have occurred since the Second World War, since the 1960s. The first Truth and Reconciliation Commission was set up in Uganda. And there have been some very notable successes in countries like Spain, like Guatemala and South Africa that I talk about. There's lots of lessons here that can help overcome, and it's really the only way, ultimately, to overcome this fixation on ideology. Everybody has their ideology. For some people, it's neo-Nazism. For some people, it's liberalism. It's just as much of an ideology, and it justifies killing in the same way. For the good of humanity, for the good of all, our enemies must be destroyed, and their spawn eradicated from the earth. Well, that's the problem. This problem of self-righteousness that we can only address when we are more or less forced to sit at the table. And one of the things, for example, I think it was in Guatemala, the implementation of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission became part of the ceasefire negotiations. The promise that there would be this kind of commission where people would be able to share their experiences and thereby have their concerns addressed. Not necessarily always in the sense of reparations, but reparations have in the past often been part of it. But that's where I see the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions have such power in the case of Ukraine, because it could easily be part of this negotiation to address the ideological issues that you've talked about specifically. It would be such a good and powerful mechanism for doing this, and for including it and its funding and its sponsorship in any sort of package of reparations. That would also be a wonderful thing to do. And I see these Truth and Reconciliation Commissions for Ukraine starting in Ukraine itself, but ultimately expanding to include many of Ukraine's neighbors. especially Russia, of course, but also all the countries that Ukraine has historically had problems with on its western border, and where those minority issues, in the case of Hungary, Romania, Slovakia,
Even Poland, yeah.
and Poland, yeah, Poland, have not been resolved. And this will be an excellent way to begin that process again of healing.
One thing I think is important is what you said, because the idea of an investigation into alleged war crimes and a truth and what do you call
Reconciliation.
it? Reconciliation commission are not mutually exclusive.
No.
But because Russia could very well say, well, you accused us of a crime in Bucha. We
Right.
want a full and
Right.
complete investigation of that, not just of it, but what about the accusations where they play? They could say, and look, we have instances of massacred civilians. We want a full investigation international into these. Now, truth and reconciliation. Well, we've got issues with the church.
Yes.
The Russian Orthodox Church being closed down. You have both crimes against that, and you have an issue of, we have a friend of mine, I haven't seen him in a while, but he is Ukrainian, and he says, I'm convinced that when this thing's over, you've got a civil war brewing in Ukraine.
It's
So
been
a truth
discussed
and
a lot in the Ukrainian press.
a truth and reconciliation commission, Russia being one thing, could be something that's utilized to prevent a civil conflict from flaring up, a really nasty civil conflict from flaring up inside of Ukraine, if it's possible.
It is one of the important things to worry about, is the kind of society that Ukraine the state of Ukrainian society after the war, and the mutual recriminations that people who have been at the front, people who never went to the front, people who avoided the front, paid bribes, all of these are large constituencies in Ukrainian society. And let's not pretend they aren't. And let's not pretend they will have, that they won't have mutual recriminations against each other after the war, if that's the path they want to pursue. But the problem is that we have to look beyond vengeance. And we have to be taught and to teach ourselves to look beyond vengeance. And the real way to do that is, as these truth and reconciliation commissions show, through what the Greeks called catharsis, a purging of the soul. The purging comes from seeing the suffering of others, really which allows you to place yourself in their shoes and they in your shoes. Without that, well, what are we talking about? There's no common citizenship. There's no common respect. Unless you can understand why, look at the other person as equal to you and as having the same rights and same value as you in your society, then yes, sadly, there is no alternative to vengeance, and the wreaking of vengeance and the defense against the vengeance of the other side is a recipe for civil war, which we want to avoid it at all costs. So I think Ukrainians, governments, and its neighbors as well, ultimately will have to face a choice. The choice is between vengeance or forgiveness. And right now we hear the Ukrainian government saying, we can't forgive. There is no forgiveness. We will never forgive. We'll never forget. Then you have chosen endless war, and you have inflicted that choice upon your own people and their children and their children. That's the reality. That's what that means. And I think people can be led to understand this once they are not duped into thinking that the West is going to come and save them. The West is going to intervene militarily and defeat Russia and basically allow Ukraine to take over portions of Russia, and that the West will be. No, none of this is going to happen. And to the extent that this reality sinks in, one has to, I think, begin to be introspective in Ukraine. And that is why we are seeing the opinion polls shifting rather significantly in Ukraine. It used to be that only a quarter or so of Ukrainians were willing to consider an immediate ceasefire and negotiations rather than pursue a conflict longer to ultimate victory. Today, that figure, the latest figures I've seen, is 61%, are now willing to say, let's make a deal. Let's at least stop the fighting and begin talking about a possible deal if it's at all feasible. And I think that number, I trust, is going to increase.
And one last thing, a prediction that I've had, and I don't know what happens with it, just throw it at you. That when this is said and done, because Donald Trump is, let's face it, you've said something. You said he's saying currently they're losing. In the future, they can't win. But he said something else. He said they could have never won. He went to the past. It's an admission. They've admitted these people were lied to. They've been took, hoodwinked, bamboozled, right? So now the truth is, it's being said to the Ukrainians, you were lied to. You never had a chance of winning or doing anything. And you're not going to win now, and you're not going to win in the future. Here's my thoughts. At some point, the Ukrainians may ask themselves, who are we really angry at? Are we angry at the Russians? Are we angry at the Europeans? Are we angry at the Americans? You know what I mean? Some of that anger as it brews, you know how it is. A person sits there and they're angry at a particular target. But at some point, when they start to contemplate, they wake up and they say, perhaps if this guy hadn't told me to go ahead and get in a fight with Mike Tyson, I wouldn't have got knocked out. So I'm not mad at Mike Tyson. I'm mad at the guy that pushed me, that convinced me to get in the ring and think I could be it. Mike Tyson was always going to beat me up. But why did I listen to this idiot that told me, that convinced me that I had a chance of fighting Mike Tyson, and now he wants to go back at that guy? And might I add, and there's arms floating all around the country, a concern, an issue that I made before the UN Security Council well over a year ago. Anyway, your thoughts on that last issue before we go?
Yeah, that issue has been coming up a lot recently, but it's a difficult one at every level, because the Ukrainians were lied to by their governments and by their Western supporters on the extent of the aid that would be provided to them. The Europeans were lied to by their governments and by the United States on the extent of the aid that would be provided. And the American people have been lied to because they were told that this would be a war that would not last for very long, that the Ukrainians would win, and that the Russian economy would force a quick end to this conflict. So there wasn't any need to worry. So this entire operation was built on a network of lies that will have to be unraveled. But there's a danger here, and I hope that the majority of Ukrainians do not succumb to it, which is we're angry at everyone.
Yes.
And we will fight everyone. And we don't trust anyone. This has been a theme. I talk about it in my book, in Ukrainian political culture among nationalists. No one can defend us. We must therefore become a military camp against everyone. After World War I, after World War II, and it's been a sub-theme of current Ukrainian nationalism, that we can be temporary allies with Europe, but ultimately we don't share anything, any fundamental values with Europe, because it's Ukraine for Ukrainians only. And that obviously doesn't jibe with a multicultural, pluralistic notion that the EU has, of which Ukraine, if Ukraine were a part, they wouldn't allow that. They would fight that as well. So that's always been a something. But so we want to address this. And again, I think the best way is to not dwell on everything, the ways in which different countries have abused the trust of others and different politicians have abused the trust of others, but to, again, focus on compassion, shared recognition of how you suffered and I suffered at the hands of others. But it turns out that we had more in common, you, my enemy, than we understood at the time. So let's rebuild our social consensus and see what together we can do to change the political environment in which we are. If that can be the solution that would come out of these recriminations, a moment of self-reflection rather than the tendency to blame others, which is so common in politics, to get beyond that, then this Ukrainian experience will have been, this tragedy for Ukraine will have a silver lining. And ultimately, that is the purpose of tragedy, is to teach people how to get out of seemingly the conflict and the endless hatred that they're in and find a new way to interact with people through compassion.
Right. And so you, not that it's going to happen, it may be a pipe dream or whatever, but you strive for a Chechen type resolution where at some point you strive for that. I'm not saying you're going to be the best of friends,
No,
as opposed to, after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, you've got the Latvias and the Estonians that just despise Russia with the seething passion of 1,000 stars. Some people that you look for the move towards the direction of.
There were always, so I want to push back against the idea, and I'm sure your commentators will comment about how naive I am, not living in the real world. Those people are wrong. I am living in the real world. The real world where people can survive is one where they reject hate and do not fight at the drop of a hat, and they don't kill their enemies because they feel offended. That's the real world that I live in. The reality is that most of the time people reach accords. Trump trivializes it by calling it deal making, but an accord is the ability to live together with others in peace and relative harmony. If you can't live in harmony, you can at least live in peace. Disagreements do not always lead to fights to the death, and they shouldn't. And it's only an ideologized worldview that tells us that it must. So what tragedy allows us to do, and there's a tragic mechanism that resolves conflict in society by forcing us to confront what we have done to offend others, what we ourselves, how we contributed to this conflict, and we need to recognize what we did, even more importantly than what others did to us. When that breakthrough comes, and there are mechanisms for doing that by putting it right before our faces so that we cannot deny it anymore, then peace results from that. We find that there is no righteous cause anymore. We cannot, we find ourselves unable to talk about just wars anymore, because we understand that every violence, every resort to violence and to warfare is unjust by definition. And I don't think that peace ever is unrealistic. I think it's a choice. It's a choice that political officials and politicians make. And throughout Ukrainian history, for all that the nationalists have promulgated war and hatred, there have been other voices that have been popular at times. And I would even argue, I would make the case, that throughout Ukrainian history since 1991, these alternative Ukrainian voices who have argued for peace and for good relations with Russia have always won at the ballot box. But their victory has been snatched away by the right-wing and nationalist forces in regional politics that have subverted the will of the entire Ukrainian nation. And we need to get back to restoring and implementing the will of the entire Ukrainian nation to get that would actually, I believe, restore peace in Ukraine and peace with its neighbors.
I just realized you made your point is well made by historical fact, because Vladimir Zelensky won with a huge majority. Why?
On a
Because
peace
he
platform.
ran on a platform of peace.
That's
And
right.
as a broad entity, overall, 70, I don't know, maybe 70% of the people. I mean, it was a
73%.
landslide on a platform of peace. So
As did his predecessor Poroshenko, as did their predecessors as well. It was always about peace. And then the center in Ukraine, these newly elected officials, didn't have the strategy or the ability to eradicate the nationalist groupings that had already become established in Ukrainian politics, and that were funded often by, again, we call them oligarchs, rich people for their own particular benefit, and not to the benefit of the Ukrainian nation or the Ukrainian people.
And the fact of the matter is this: that's one of the reasons he's afraid to have an election right now, because he knows the voice of the Ukrainian people as a plurality will want to move in a more, shall I say, I'll just use the word, in a direction towards the resolution, the nonviolent resolution of their problems. That if given the opportunity right now and allowed to vote, that the plurality, even if it's only 50.01%, which, as you said, will be higher, will vote for, hey, you know what? We want to go back. In fact, I had some friends, and they had families in Ukraine all during the war. And they were saying, yes, I have friends in this town. And they're all saying the same thing. Look, we just want this bombing to end so we can go back to a regular life. That's what common people were saying in Ukraine.
There's a very simple first step to take. You don't even have to aim as high or as far away as peace talks. Just dialogue. Just sit down and talk. Once that key breakthrough is done inside Ukraine, talk to the other side, allow other voices to be represented in the monolithic marathon of the media, allow other political parties. Poroshenko himself has just been sanctioned by the Security and National Security and Defense Committee, essentially for treason, for continuing his private commercial affairs at the expense of Ukraine with Russian entities. And now he is the former president of Ukraine, pro-Western, is in exactly the same boat as his erstwhile political opponent, Viktor Medvedchuk, who was, I remind people, the chief of staff under a previous Ukrainian president, Kuchma. Two polar opposites, reflecting both of them vital constituencies of the Ukrainian nation, have now both been indicted. So they have something, they have some shared experience now under Zelensky that maybe, maybe that'll lead to some dialogue between them.
Thank you very much. Well, I hope one of the first things we see is the shuttering and locking and the oppression of people in the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine. I hope we see that soon. The monks that have been arrested, beaten, and house arrest, that would be something very important and critical to start culturally speaking to address. Thank you very much, Dr. Petro. Where can everybody find your important work online?
www.npetro.net.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. And it is very important that you share this on all your social media platforms. Thank you very much that you go to Dr. Petro's site. And of course, thank you very much. If anyone can afford to contribute to the channel, that's highly appreciated. If not, it doesn't matter. Just click on the like button and subscribe to the channel if you're not already subscribed, and share this all over the place. These types of conversations are very important, and they need to be shared on X and Telegram and Facebook and wherever else you have the opportunity to share them. Thank you very much.
Let the dialogue begin.
Yes.